mission of the GMF, which is to encourage communication with an emphasis on electronic media on issues, trends, and values of importance to present and future generations of Montanans. The GMF was actually founded in 1958 by pioneer Montana broadcaster Ed Craney. He was a real visionary. He was an entrepreneur, and he cared deeply about Montana. And I think Ed would be very pleased today that we are using this new electronic medium to encourage communication on election polling in Montana. The program is also being produced by the Bureau of Business and Economic Research at the University of Montana. The Bureau is Montana's oldest and most respected business research center, serving as the preeminent source of business and economic information and analysis for 70 years. BBER has earned the reputation as an independent, nonpartisan, objective research organization bringing facts, information, and analysis to bear on issues of importance to the Montana economy. For our program today, we have 4 special speakers. They are Nicole McCleskey, a partner with Public Opinion Strategies, a national polling and public opinion research firm that's a partner in the respected NBC News Wall Street Journal polls. Dr. Eric Riley, an associate professor of political science at Montana State University, where he directs the MSU Human Ecology Learning and Problem Solving, or HELPS lab, that conducts polling in Montana and our region. It recently completed a Western States coronavirus survey, which contained polling on Montana's upcoming political races. John Baldridge is Director of Survey Research at the Bureau of Business and Economic Research. He recently completed the 3rd in a series of polls that examined Montanans' top public policy issues of interest, preferred Montana news sources for information on those issues, and perceptions of news source credibility. And Dr. Andrew Smith, Director of the University of New Hampshire Survey Center, who is also on the American Association for Public Opinion Research Task Force for evaluation of 2020 election polls. So as you see, we have a wonderful lineup, and they will be presenting a bit and then also taking questions. I will also remind everyone that we should have sent you full bios in the invitations that you received to be with us today. For all of our speakers, we will be posting those bios and also a copy of the recorded program on the BBER and GMF websites early next week. Also, if you have questions during the session today, use the chat feature, please, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and just send the questions and we'll be watching those. We'll answer as many as we can. We have a few that have already come in, and we'll be fielding those during the program. So let's get started with our session by asking Nicole McCleskey to set the stage for our discussion. So Nicole, it's all yours. Nicole, I think you're muted.
Those buttons moved. Sorry.
There we go.
Thank you for inviting me today. I think this is a really important topic, a really important discussion, and I'm really happy to be a part of it. I know I'm in the company of some renowned experts in the field, so I'm very interested to hear what they have to say. It's an important topic that we engage on and hear what everyone has to say. You know, this new technology is fantastic because it's certainly allowing us to communicate with each other, and hopefully we have even higher participation today because people actually don't have to leave the comfort of their home or office to participate today. But I am not a fan. I much prefer the in-person interaction than the online stuff. So I miss that dynamic, but we'll get through this. Let's move forward. How do I move the page down? Cancel. Okay, my page is not moving down. There we go. Perfect. What I hope to cover today in my 10 minutes or so is a little bit about the health of today's polling industry. The second topic I'd like to cover is how technological change is impacting polling and what we do. And then focus on a little bit about the methodology we use. And why that matters. Now, I am primarily a political pollster. It is what I do for a living. I also do quite a bit of public affairs work. Our world has changed. I've been doing this for 21 years. So things have certainly shifted over that period of time. And we are moving rapidly with it to try and keep up and try and change as well as needed. But holding true to a very rigorous methodological standard. So, and that is not always easy to do. So one of the questions I often get is polling broken? And I pulled this quote out. I thought this was interesting from this article I wrote. It says, ultimately, although the polling industry faces a range of substantial challenges, we find no evidence to support the claims of a crisis in the accuracy of polling. And now that was based on a multinational study review of polling that had been conducted over several years. However, periodically, pollsters get it wrong and are subject to a great deal of attention, particularly when this influences expectations of who will form the government. Indeed, this can lead to methodological reflection and innovation, and in turn, improvements in polling. And certainly that is true. There have been lots of conversations about the accuracy of polling. I've even heard the question, is polling dead? And of course, my perspective is absolutely not. And there are several good reasons for that. But primarily, there's like any industry, there's good polling and there's bad polling or not so good polling. And it's kind of our job, and hopefully what we work through today is how do we determine what's good or better and what's not so good and not so reliable. And I think that's true of any industry. It's certainly true of academia. There are going to be your good professors and your not so good, and the same with journalists, good and not so good. Same with polling. So hopefully what we do today will shed a little bit of light about the good and the bad in polling. The 2016 polls, that was a huge, source of conversation. And taking this from the Pew Research Center, it was interesting. I think it's just a helpful reminder that, 2016 wasn't all bad. And they say was in fact, the 2016 election was not in fact an industry-wide failure for the polls. Rigorous national surveys were quite accurate by historical standards. An average of the final publicly released polls suggested that Hillary Clinton would win the overall popular vote by 3 percentage points. And she ultimately won by 2 points. And then it goes on to say, and while there were real misses among the state level polls, a comprehensive postmortem by the American Association for Public Opinion Research found that most of the problems were amenable to fixing. So I think what that tells us is I think that the primary concern people have is with what happens at the state level. And I use this in air quotes. There are a lot of people out there doing polls. They're not all the same. And I think, approaching this topic so we can kind of understand what's good and what's bad, because the public opinion is very valuable. Understanding what it is, being able to capture that, to communicate that, to articulate that to the public. I think that's a really important function of democracy. So to relegate polls to yesteryear, I think is unfair and unwise. And we just, I think have to work through how we separate the good from the bad. As a starting point, an important reminder is polls are not predictors, never. And you've probably heard this before. They're a snapshot in time. That is in fact what they are. And a lot of the conversation about 2016 were polls taken 2 weeks out from the election. 2 weeks out from an election is an immense amount of time. So lots of activity, normal campaign activity, TV ads, mail, door-to-door, digital ads. I mean, the full range of things that are happening during that 2-week period. And then you also have these people called undecided voters who may break one way or the other. And in fact, I think the polls showed primarily the undecideds broke to Trump in 2016. So when we look at a poll, we have to consider the amount of time that has passed between that and election day, because a 2-week period is actually a very, very long period of time in the campaign world. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what has evolved with respect to polling. Of course, years ago, polling was conducted by mail and in person, and then we got to the telephone. And so that has served us well for decades now. But we are in the midst of another change. Technology is driving change in the polling industry today. With phones, polling has become very difficult and much more expensive. You consider our response rates, actually getting somebody on the phone, have dropped from 36% in 1997, which is about when I started in the industry, to only 6% today. So it's certainly, that makes this a much more difficult proposition to get a survey actually completed. So what has happened is and then the response rates drop, obviously, because people are not answering the phone, whether it's call blocking, caller ID, all these different kinds of technologies that are available today, that has led to that drop in response rates. The internet, of course, is filling that void. It has introduced new challenges to the polling industry. So it's not been an easy or smooth transition, and it is certainly not complete or a perfect solution by any means. It is certainly there. It's something we're working with, but it is not the end. It is not the total transition of polling. I come from a view that not all polling is created equal. As I said, there's good and there's bad. So not every poll you're going to see is going to be a good one. One problem, as the Pew Research Center's found, is that high quality state level polling is sparse and underfunded. Because telephone polling has become more expensive, some in the research space they've gone to other methodologies that are less expensive. And in some cases, they cut corners. And that's unfortunate. That would be bad polling. That does happen. But I'm going to explain a little bit about what that cutting corners might look like in a little bit. But because of this, the difficulty of getting people on the phone and the lack of funding, I think that has driven kind of a methodological change, as well as perhaps some not so good polling methodologies. And I think this is where mistakes were made in 2016, is more at the state level, as I've mentioned. So a couple things to talk through with methodology. You want to consider who's the sponsor of a poll. Just because somebody is more of has a partisan leaning, or it comes from a campaign, does not necessarily mean it's a bad poll or it's biased in any way. But it is worth considering where the source of the survey. Certainly, I think you'll want to approach that with, you want to do your due diligence to make sure that things were done properly. Sample size and margin of error, always important. And I think some of the other presenters today are speaking more to that. But in terms of Montana, my perspective is, what's the sample size you need to yield a reliable result? You don't need 600 or 800 interviews in Montana to get something that's credible. You could do a 400 or 500 sample, and it's a very credible result. But I know other people are speaking to that, so I'll leave that for the moment. I do want to talk a little bit about what methodologies we use today, and the pros and cons, the good and the bad there. And then, of course, what is the demographic and partisan composition of the survey? Those are key questions you want to be able to ask that will make you a good consumer of the polling you're looking at. So talking about the telephone a little bit, still live phone interviews are the strongest and most reliable methodology available to us. Of course, it is also the most expensive. The Pew Research Center has done studies. They've done studies dating back to 1997, and they found that there's little relationship between response rates, which I said is now 6%, and survey accuracy. That we still get a representative sample, even though fewer people are actually taking calls. It is still reflective of the population. It leaves open the question, however, is that if it drops down to 2%, how accurate is that? That's still an open question, but there's confidence still that we're getting a representative sample on the phone. The other thing with the telephone is that we have now reached a place in American life where most of America is a cell phone only or mostly household. So our minimum standard for interviews is to conduct 50% by cell phone. That's a minimum. And in Montana, the latest CDC numbers had the cell phone only households at 52%. That means they don't have a landline at all. So when you look at a survey, you want to be able to say that they did an adequate number of cell phones to be representative. And if you don't do it, what happens obviously is you're going to get less younger voters, you're going to get fewer younger voters, and you're also going to get less diversity with your survey. So those are a couple things to consider as you have to look at the number of cell phone interviews conducted. The other technology that's often employed is what we call IVR surveys, interactive voice recorded, or robocalls. This is a more frequently used methodological tool because it is less expensive. And I also think it is less reliable. I put the little girl on the phone there. I thought it was funny, and I'm kind of joking, but not really, because when you make these phone calls, there's no guarantee that you're getting an actual voter on the phone. You don't know who's taking the survey. And that's one of the biggest drawbacks. You have no control over who takes the survey. When I do live interview phone surveys, we ask for a person on the person on the voter file specifically. So we know who we're talking to, that they are an actual voter in the household. And that's infinitely more reliable than somebody just picking up the phone and pushing some buttons. There are also some methodological questions around the IVR surveys. They tend to be much higher female. You may see 70% female. They may be skewed by age or other demographic variables. So there's no control over that with some of these IVR surveys. You can try and do things to control for them. Instituting quota management to make sure, for instance, you don't get 70% female, you're at 52. That starts to increase your costs. So as you start to do things that are more methodologically rigorous, you start to incur some additional costs. So that's kind of the long and short of IVR surveys. Don't love them. I realize they have a place and they're a less expensive tool, but you have to make sure that there's still methodological rigor, that it's representative of the population. I want to talk a little bit about internet surveys. I do believe that these are useful tools, but not for political polling. They're still less reliable, and here's why. 10% of Americans are still offline. And those 10% look very different than the other 90% of people that are online. So we are underrepresenting typically a lesser educated, more ethnically diverse, lower income type of population if we're not including them in our surveys. So that's certainly one drawback. There's no universal list of email addresses from which to draw a sample. Unlike phone interviewing, we can find a voter list and there's a phone number for everyone attached to it. There is not such a list for emails. So we have no way to kind of find a random sample of people on the internet. So what you rely on when you do an internet survey, what they call panels. And these are generally not representative. What happens is vendors put together these panels. These are opt-in generally, where people can choose to be a part of them. So there's some self-selection there already. One of the principles of good survey research is random sampling. Where everyone has an equal chance to participate or be included in the universe. If you are doing self-selection, you violate probably one of the most fundamental rules of polling is random sampling. So that people don't have an equal opportunity. You are relying on panels. Sometimes these panels, you'll get people who take multiple surveys a day or a week. They become professional respondents. So in that way, they are not truly representative of the population. Now, there are good panels out there, like the Pew American Trends panel is a good panel. There are others, but they have included some probability basis for including people in their panels. What they will do, they will send out mail or phone surveys to recruit people to their panel. And that's done randomly. They'll do random mail, random phones, trying to recruit people to their panel.
And then 1 minute, yeah. Please. 1 minute.
Yeah. These can be more, and that just increases expense there, and that's why they're better, but they are more expensive. Okay, couple things on survey composition. When you're looking at a survey, you want to make sure these things accurately reflect the population that they are representing. In this case, Montana. Does it reflect Montana by gender, by age, by party identification, by region, by ethnicity, and education? Let me just flag that education really quickly for you. All of these things, they should be represented in the survey, but education has become the variable that is distinguishing good from bad surveys. Surveys will typically be a little bit skewed a little bit toward the college graduate and postgraduate. That means the lesser educated population is not being well represented in many surveys. That can skew things pretty dramatically. And if you're looking at the presidential election, just for instance, it is a kind of a non-college educated voter that is more pro-Trump. So if you have a very well educated survey population, it's probably going to skew against Trump. So these are some factors you should be considering as you're consuming a poll to make sure that it is representative of the population. Final two things I wanted to touch on really quickly. If you look for the sponsor of a survey and you say it came from a campaign, it can't be trusted. Not necessarily, but you will want to consider how questions are worded and the question order. So they may release a ballot from a campaign. They may tell you what the ballot is according to their survey, but you want to say, did that come early in the survey? Did it come late in the survey after a lot of messaging or other things that might influence the ballot, a lot of anti-Trump questions, for instance, and then you asked a ballot? That's usually going to bias the ballot. So
Nicole, let me just interrupt and say that maybe we can get back to some of this in the Q&A. But that was a great setup to what we're going to be talking about for the rest of this program. So now let me just move to our next speaker, Dr. Eric Riley. And Eric, I'm going to ask you if you'll just kind of talk a little bit more about Montana-based election polling, particularly against the background of what Nicole just talked about.
Hello, and thank you for the invitation to talk today. As Bill mentioned earlier, I am the director of the HELPS Lab at Montana State University in Bozeman, and I will be talking about election polling based in Montana. So the HELPS Lab is a social science research lab. We started operations in 2015 and complete a few dozen projects per year. Most of those are for researchers, but also some projects for state government agencies, and some projects involve news media organizations. I've got a picture of our main web page here. We have a public archive with results from previous surveys, so you can access those. We've got the Western States Coronavirus Survey still here on the main page, and that's helpslab.montana.edu for those of you who want to access it. We usually post our results to that page. Our first big election survey was in 2018, and it was a mail poll. That was our mode. I'm going to talk more about that. Nicole didn't even mention mail polls. She talked about them being an older method, but there's a number of reasons we went that way and some technologies that are very helpful. The population of interest was all registered voters in Montana, so we obtained the voter file from the Secretary of State's office and used that, and then sampled randomly, but in a stratified way. So we sampled within state house districts proportional to their size, and then mailed out 10,215 questionnaires. That's a lot. We weren't sure what the response rate was going to be, and we got a 20% response rate, which is pretty good. We also had a post-election survey, and that went out to all of the people who responded to the first survey. So it's 2,079, and we had a 68% response rate there, which is very good, but these were people who were predisposed, we knew, to responding to these surveys already. And then Nicole talked about weighting. We use something called raked weights, and so we use the characteristics that Nicole had mentioned to weight the responses back so that they look like the population of registered voters. We do not have a list, or we don't have population data on party identification in the state of Montana because you don't have to register for a party. So instead we used Vote for Trump in 2016 as a weight. And my understanding was that the campaigns were doing the same thing in the state of Montana, and that worked pretty well. Just some brief results here. The questionnaire covered a lot. One of the reasons we used a mail method for the survey is that we're using this for academic purposes. We've made the data public so people can use them for research. But we asked about some political and electoral kinds of phenomena as well. So we asked about interest in the upcoming elections, how people had voted in previous elections, their approval of different public officials in the state and nationally, and then their intentions, who they were going to vote for in the upcoming elections. So we've got the results from the pre-election survey, and I'm using survey and poll interchangeably here as terms. On the left-hand side there, you see the Senate, and we had Tester up 46 to 43. And if you redistribute those don't know responses here, you can't vote don't know in the actual election, we get very, very close to the final results, which were 50.3 to 46.8%. On the House side here on the right part of the slide, we had Gianforte up by about 7.5 points. Actual results were 50.9 to 46.2. We do think there was some movement late in that campaign, and Williams had some momentum. But also, as I'll talk about margins of error, and this is also, the results are feasible based on our margins of error and all of that. I do want to mention, Nicole had said that it's important to know who sponsored the poll. In the case of these 2018 election surveys, that was the MSU Office of the President and the Vice President for Research. Montana Television Network was a partner in that initial poll, but a lot of the work was done by political science researchers at the university, and then the Helps Lab actually administered the poll. More recently, we conducted the Western States Coronavirus Survey. That was done in April. We had a number of constraints that made a mail poll infeasible. One was cost, but we also didn't have access to printing services at the time. And mail wasn't necessarily reliable. We weren't sure what was going to happen with the Postal Service. And so we used a web-based survey in this case, and it was a survey of Qualtrics Online Probability Panel. Qualtrics is a web-based survey software company. And this is a panel just like Nicole had mentioned. So they've recruited people to participate in these surveys. And basically they use a quota system. So we asked for more respondents from Montana. You see the map here, 738 there, about 500 from Utah, Colorado, and North Dakota, with the states chosen based on the different kinds of stay-at-home orders or the fact that they didn't have stay-at-home orders in the month of April. I've got an example of a question here from the software in the middle of the slide. We asked lots of questions, public health and policy questions. I'm focusing here on the political questions, so the response to the crisis. We asked about the Senate elections in Montana and Colorado, and then also about the upcoming presidential campaign. This one again was sponsored by the Vice President for Research and by the Department of Political Science, and then the University of Denver was also a partner in this poll. Some select results, again on the left-hand side, Governor Bullock's approval as it related to handling the coronavirus pandemic. You see it's very strong. About 3/4 of people approved or strongly approved. And then we had results for the US Senate, and we showed Bullock up by 7 percentage points at this time. We suspect a lot of that was due to the approval and the public nature of Bullock's comments through this period and the fact that he was constantly in front of cameras. This was because of the size of the number of respondents or our sample. This was within the margins of error. I'll get into that more in a little bit, but so the way we talked about it was as a statistical tie. It could be that Bullock was not ahead, but the point estimates showed him up by 7 points. This year, we are again going to do the pre-election and post-election surveys with the panel in the second part. We'll have the same election content, and we're going to add the governor's race, since there is one this time around. And then we're going to follow up on some of those coronavirus questions that we asked in April, because some things have changed in significant ways based on national numbers, and we want to see what that looks like in Montana. I'm going to talk briefly about different survey modes and trade-offs. Nicole got into this a little bit, but why did we choose to go with mail? The big thing was that the voter file has mailing addresses for everyone, right? So we can potentially include everyone and make sure that this is representative. That's not the case with phone numbers, and it's especially not the case with email addresses. We did get a good response rate, and we anticipated it would be pretty good. So that was another motivation. And it's also less intrusive. People can answer that survey when they want. We usually give them a deadline, but they have some flexibility. On the downside, it is slower. Nicole talked about how quickly things change in politics. Again, we wanted to use this for some academic purposes. But we were collecting data over 2 or 3 week periods. Things can change over those periods. In the pre-election poll, the Kavanaugh nomination hearings happened in the middle of it, and so numbers may have changed a little bit throughout that period. Processing all of the paper and data entry can take a lot of time. We do have optical mark recognition software, so we can just scan the return surveys and the data goes straight into the data file, and so that speeds things up considerably and allows us to do this and to turn the results around in a few days, really. And then you have the resources, the paper and ink and all of those things that make this less desirable. With web surveys, they're easy to administer, they're low cost, you get results quickly, you aren't using those paper resources. But as Nicole talked about, we worry about representativeness of the sample, and you do get these survey taking professionals, people who do this all the time, and you worry about what that means for the kinds of responses they're going to give to questions. And then lastly, you have phone, and we don't do a lot of phone work. A lot of survey centers do primarily phone work. You get quick results. You can use random digit dialing, so you can use random probability kind of sampling. The administration is a little bit difficult because you have to monitor the workers. I worry a lot about self-selection. So everybody who has a cell phone basically has caller ID. And if the people who decide to answer the phone are fundamentally different from the people who decide not to answer the phone, and if that's related to your questions, that's a serious problem. Response rates, as Nicole mentioned, have become very low, and it is intrusive. People don't like it, and we didn't want to make people upset with our first time out with an election poll. So we decided not to use a phone poll. Now, the last couple topics I want to talk about here are sample sizes and margins of error. And this might get a little technical, but it's really important for people to understand. Larger samples tend to be better, but there are diminishing returns. So if you want a margin of error of say plus or minus 3%, you need about 1,000 or 1,100 respondents. That depends on the size of the population, but in a state, that's the case regardless of the size of the state. We had over 2,000 responses and we got to plus or minus 2.2%. So that's not a huge gain. Again, we weren't sure how many we were going to get, but that does increase our precision. What's typically reported by polling organizations and by the news media is an overall poll margin of error, and that's generally the worst case scenario. So for values that are close to 50%, those margins are larger. So we calculate based on those numbers. If you're using subsamples, so if you're just looking at Republicans, those numbers go up, and that's a complication that normally doesn't get reported and I think would confuse people. As you get closer to 0 and 100% for these values, the confidence intervals actually shrink because there's more confidence and precision. I've got this confidence level that's usually 95%. That's, again, usually not mentioned in any of the results. What that means is, I've got these little brackets here. There's a 95% chance that the real population value falls within that range. It might not, right? We might have an unusual sample. It might be something to do with probability sampling that just made us get a bad result. But we're 95% sure it's somewhere in there. So if we look at the Gianforte result from our pre-election poll, our point estimate, and it's important to mention that these are estimates, right? They aren't actual values, was 47.6%. When you calculate the lower bound and the upper bound, his numbers were at that plus or minus 2.2%. So we were pretty sure he was somewhere between 45.4 and 49.8%. Similarly with Williams, she was close enough to 50% that it was plus or minus 2.2. Due to rounding, the numbers don't quite work here, but somewhere between 38.1 and 42.4%. And then Eleanor Swanson here, the Libertarian candidate, at 2.4%. The margin of error is much smaller because we're closer to one of those ends, 0 or 100%. So we were confident it was somewhere between 1.7 and 3.1. Now the gap between Gianforte and Williams was outside these two margins of error, which gave us confidence in saying that he was definitely ahead. She might have been higher in this range, he might have been lower, and that explains some of what happened with the actual results.
Eric, 1 minute, please.
Okay. So I've talked about the Helps Lab. Again, that's at helpslab.montana.edu. We post results there. They're available to everyone. There's sometimes an embargo period, but we make the data public if people want to work with those. I've talked about those election polls, 2018 and 2020, and we had the coronavirus poll in April. Those results are also available. I've talked a little bit about those survey modes and the trade-offs, and hopefully provided some guidance on sample sizes and margins of error, which are more technical kinds of issues, but I do think they're important. It's important that those are relayed to people accurately. Thank you.
Eric, thank you very much. Very interesting, and thanks for the insights, particularly with respect to Montana. We are getting some questions. We're probably going to have to hold them till the end of the program. But right now, I'd like to introduce John Baldridge with BBER. John is going to talk a little bit more about Montana-based media and issue polling. John? I think you're still muted there. Yep.
Hi, everybody. I'm John Baldridge, and I'm the Director of Survey Research at University of Montana in Missoula. Before I really get started, there's a couple of things that I need to do that are really important for everyone here to know. First, I want to thank the Greater Montana Foundation for their insight and their mission and their willingness to help this come off. It's just vital for us to be able to discuss these sorts of things so that we can be better informed citizens. And I'm grateful to Greater Montana Foundation for giving us that opportunity. Second, I want to thank the Montana Chamber of Commerce, who behind the scenes has helped us get the word out about this webinar and also helped us with some technical things. So thank you to the Montana Chamber of Commerce. Finally, there's a couple of people at Bureau of Business and Economic Research that I want to thank for helping this to come off. The first is the director of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research, Dr. Pat Barkey. Pat has made a climate in which his researchers can do this sort of thing, and he encourages us to do them, and I'm very grateful to him. But finally, I want to thank the irrepressible Dr. Bill Whitsitt. He really is a mover and shaker behind doing this. He has helped this be a success, in my opinion, and I'm very grateful to him. So with that, let me share my screen and I'll get rolling. All right, in the time that I have, there are really two contributions that I would like to make to this field guide to 2020 Montana election polling. First, my first contribution to the field guide is giving you another example of what a good Montana-based poll looks like. And second, what I want to do is leave you with two key questions that you ought to ask every time you encounter a poll so that you can help to evaluate for yourself whether the poll is credible or not. So in 2019, University of Montana Bureau of Business and Economic Research conducted the third in a series of polls sponsored by Greater Montana Foundation to examine Montanans' sources of news, their perceptions about those sources of news, and their perceptions about the credibility of news. The reason I wanted to bring up this particular poll is to give you some insight into why polling can really be valuable for Montana. Our news media is an absolutely vital component of our democracy here in Montana. And one of the only ways that we can know about whether our news media here in Montana is credible in the mind of the public is to do a poll, is to do a survey, is to do something scientific so that we can determine what proportion of the population finds Montana's sources of news credible and what proportion does not find them credible. In this case, in the spring of 2019, we asked adult Montanans how credible various types of news sources were at that time. And you can see by this slide that there is a very wide range of opinion about the credibility of various types of news source in Montana. This matters to us all because of the vital nature of our news media, the vital role that they play in providing us the key information that we need to make decisions. You'll see here that local sources, local broadcast TV, local weekly papers, Montana daily papers, and local radio scored highest in credibility. And that's to the credit of Montana's news media, but it also shows that the responsibility they have for all of us. Next, the survey that we did for Greater Montana Foundation dug a little more deeply into the trust that people have or do not have in various sources of media. And by doing this, we're able to show that perhaps our democracy, at least in Montana, has some problems. In particular, there is a vast partisan divide in Montana in terms of the sources of news that people trust. Among the people who said that Fox News is the most trusted, 97% of those Montanans identify as Republicans. And you can see also the partisan divide for the news sources NPR, CBS, and CNN. Again, vastly divided and primarily Democrats. So now I want to give you a little bit of an inside look into the methods of this survey to show you what a good method statement from a pollster looks like. And if you're and that is really vital for your evaluation of whether a poll is credible or not credible. This particular poll was randomly sampled. It was administered in February and March of 2019. It was administered by mail on the internet. It had 579 completions. It had a response rate of 36%, and it had a sampling error rate that Eric talked about of 6%, plus or minus 6%. In addition, the summary was weighted by gender, age, education, urban versus rural, and party identification. The survey sample was purchased from a very reputable firm known as Dynata Incorporated, and the survey was sponsored by the Greater Montana Foundation. Finally, the full question wording is available to anybody who is interested in evaluating those questions. When you encounter a survey, you ought to look to see that the pollster is transparent about showing you these specific types of methods. Finally, I want to leave you with two questions that you ought to ask about every survey that you encounter to evaluate whether it's very credible or not. First, was the survey randomly sampled? The Associated Press actually offers some criteria for the news media so that they can use that criteria to evaluate whether a poll that they might publish is credible or not. And according to the Associated Press Style Guide, Associated Press says probability-based polls are the best method of ensuring the results of a survey reflect the true opinion of the group being surveyed. So if you find that a poll is somewhat vague about whether it was randomly sampled or that it was not randomly sampled at all, take some care. It can still give you some good information, but some non-probability polls may not be representative at all. In fact, Associated Press Style Guide says many online polls are conducted using the opt-in panels discussed earlier, which are composed of people who volunteer to take part. And research into these kinds of surveys finds that even traditional weighting after the fact can't really make these surveys representative of the population as a whole. So take care with those types of surveys. Finally, ask yourself, was the pollster transparent about their methods? Did they have the gumption to tell you how they did it? If they did, then the poll may well be reputable. Associated Press says reputable poll sponsors will disclose the methodology used to conduct the survey. So if they disclose it, that checks a box off in your field guide so that you can say, yeah, this poll, if the other criteria that you use also meet your standard, is reputable. But if a pollster does not disclose their methods, then you probably need to dismiss the poll altogether. And if they don't disclose most of the methods that you want to look at to evaluate whether the poll is credible or not, then you need to be very, very careful. And with that, I'll stop and turn it over to the next speaker. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
Well, thank you very much, John. And I will say we are already getting some questions. And again, I think we're going to hold these until after Dr. Smith speaks here for a minute. But some questions about both the methodology and the transparency and all of that, but also some questions that we'll be able to answer too about some of the other findings of the media research work that John was talking about. So now I'd like to turn to Dr. Andrew Smith, University of New Hampshire. And Andy, I'll let you go ahead and take it from here.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for inviting me here. And thanks to the Greater Montana Foundation for putting this on. I think this really is a very good civic service. So I was asked to talk more broadly about polling and what are the overall, how do we look at overall poll quality, which is a really big topic. So I've got a lot to cover. I'm going to go through a lot of this quickly. Thankfully, I'm going to be reiterating a number of points that have been made already today, but I do want to talk about three major things. First, why we bother with polls at all? Why did we, in the media, get involved with polling? Secondly, how the polls have impacted people's perceptions of the media. And then finally, what you can do as journalists or consumers of polls to better report polls or better analyze whether or not this is something you really want to pay attention to or not. So first of all, let me give you a very, very short history of polling. And I will start this out by saying the media's decision to use polling is frankly a business decision. It's a way they can make money. So the first poll that we have documented in the United States goes back to 1824. The Harrisburg Pennsylvanian did a poll in the Harrisburg area about the Jackson election, the Andrew Jackson election. And the reason they did that was they thought it would help them sell papers, and it did. We can move up to through the later part of the 1800s, and we saw a big increase of what are called straw polls. And by 1896, we had upwards of a dozen of these or more going on across the country. And in 1936, the Literary Digest, which at that time was the largest magazine in the country, conducted this huge pre-election poll in the 36 election. They sent out more than 8 million ballots, got 2 million back, and they predicted that Alf Landon would be the next president. And we all remember the Landon presidency. Actually not. It didn't happen. FDR won fairly comfortably. Two things we learned from this. Sample composition. Where is your sampling frame drawn from? Well, they drew their sampling frame from people with automobiles, so motor vehicle registration lists, and telephone numbers. And this is 1936, the depths of the Depression. Who had cars and telephones? Well, largely wealthier people. And back in 1936, that meant largely Republicans. So they asked a bunch of Republicans who they were going to vote for. And not surprisingly, they said the Republican candidate. The second thing this tells us is there is no law of large numbers that makes up for bad sampling. If you conducted calculated your margin of sampling error on 2 million people, it would be about 0.00001%. But obviously it didn't get an accurate prediction of the election. So some people were happy about this. There are 3 people here: Archibald Crosley, Elmo Roper, and George Gallup, big names in the early years of polling. They all conducted surveys during this election using what they called scientific polling, and they use what are called quota samples to better represent the electorate. Gallup actually, with this, is kind of interesting. He guaranteed people that bought the Gallup poll that he would be more accurate than the Literary Digest poll, that they got their money back. And he didn't have to pay off on that one. It wasn't very accurate, but he didn't have to pay off. But the important thing here is that newspapers really went in for this, because they, again, and Gallup sold them this, that if you run the Gallup poll, you'll sell more papers. So it's a business decision as well. Move on a little bit with methodological changes up to the famous Dewey defeats Truman election in 1948. Found 2 things of this. Obviously, Truman beat Dewey. But the things we found out was that in that last month of the election, things can change. The Gallup poll and other polls were completed early in October of that year, almost a month before the election. And also they used those quota samples, which by the end of World War II, the American public had moved around a lot. We had movements of African Americans to northern cities where they could vote, whereas they couldn't have voted before. General movement from the rural areas to cities. So the quotas they were using weren't very good. And if you're using quota samples, it's only good as the quotas you use. So we got rid of quota sampling after that, went to random sampling. During the 1960s and 70s, we went from in-person surveys to telephone surveys, largely because it's cheaper, and that led to a proliferation of polls, because cheap means a lot more people can do it. We are in the midst of another one of these technological shifts right now that Nicole spoke of. We've got a paradigm shift in the survey business from telephone surveys to web-based surveys, largely because they're much, much, much less expensive. But the problem is most web surveys use non-probability sample. Here's just a study that I've been doing for quite some time now. It goes back and looks, you can see this big spike in the number of web-based surveys between 2014 and 16. That's not likely to go down because it is so much cheaper. So the reason I really want to ask, why does this matter? Polls are good business for the media. Web polls are very cheap. This led to a lot of the problems that we saw with the state polls in 2016. So eyeballs plus clicks equals money. That's the current model that we use in the media market to generate revenue. And that model really depends on polls, because people will click on polls much, much more than they will other articles. And it really doesn't matter what the quality of the poll is, unfortunately, people will click on it. So that leads to a cost. So in 2016, certainly Donald Trump was talking about the fake polls and fake news that's out there. Here's a nice quote that says, poll says 4 and 5 don't trust Washington, and 9 and 10 don't trust polls. So we have a real problem there. But why does that matter? Because it frankly influences people's perceptions of the media. So this is a chart this was a study that was done by Politico. It found that only about a third of people thought polls were generally accurate. Another third thought they were biased in favor of Hillary Clinton. Certainly Republicans did. Very few people thought polls were biased in favor of Donald Trump. And that led to, I think, one of these big things that you've seen over the last several decades is that there's less trust in the media. In this most recent Gallup poll in 2016, 62% of respondents in America thought that the media generally favors one party over the other, and 43% said that's the Democratic Party. So that leads to this general distrust in media that we've got today. And this is, frankly, bad for business. Reporting polls is good, but if you lose trust, you've got real problems. So what can you do? these are a bunch of questions that I think that John has already touched on and others here have touched on that I think you should look at as good consumers of polls. You can look at Mike Traugott and Paul Lavrakis wrote a book called The Voter's Guide to Election Polls. This is, I think, an important thing. But here's the things that I think are important in my view, in my order of importance. First off, who paid for it? I want to know who's behind it. Secondly, was it what's the sampling frame? Was it a probability sample, that is a random sample, or a non-probability sample? Third, how were respondents selected? Did we use likely voters? Did we use registered voters? Or did we use all adults? How were the data collected? Live operators, IVR, were they on the web, some combination of these things? What were the weighting methods used and what weighting variables were used? What is the exact wording of the questionnaire? And ideally get the full questionnaire. Were the questions and response orders rotated? What was the response rate? How many callbacks did people make? Did they do refusal conversions if it's a telephone survey? What were the dates? And then finally, the number of people interviewed. So the margin of sampling error is often seen as an indicator of the accuracy of the survey, but all of these other things, I think, which fall into what we call non-sampling error, I think are far, far more problematic than sampling error. A good, well-drawn random sample of 200 people, I think, would be more accurate than a poorly done non-random sample with a lot of other problems. So I just want to talk about a couple things here. To Nicole's point earlier, just because a survey is conducted by a partisan organization doesn't mean it's less accurate. In 2016, we saw that partisan surveys and surveys coming from nonpartisan organizations were pretty close, not too much different there, but it's something you need to pay attention to. Non-probability sampling, this is a big issue that several people have talked about today. Convenience samples are what most web surveys are done, and you have many of those professional poll takers. There's no theoretical framework like the central limit theorem that we all got flustered over in our statistics class. You really cannot calculate a margin of sampling error in a non-probability sample, although many people calculate credibility intervals instead of confidence intervals. And finally, weighting adjustments are very, very difficult to figure out from a pollster. They keep a black box very well closed so nobody understands what their special sauce is. And finally, they're really cheap though. So that's why we're seeing a proliferation of them. Sampling frame, very important. You want to use a listed sample? Well, listed samples are much less expensive, but you have some systematic biases there. If you don't have a telephone number that's public, it's not going to be associated with this. So it's hard to make telephone calls to people that you don't have a telephone number for. It tends to be biased towards older voters because younger people, for example, who haven't voted in the past, they may be able to vote. Like in Montana, you can have late registration. They won't even be on the list. So they are systematically excluded, but they are less expensive. Random digit dialing for telephone surveys, it's unbiased, but very expensive to do. Who was interviewed? Also important. This chart shows a more democratic sample. Older, if you look at all adults, you tend to get a more democratic sample. If you go down to registered voters, it's a little bit less democratic, and likely voters is the least democratic. And this makes a difference because, like in 2016, you can see that the polls with likely voters showed a much closer race than did polls with just registered voters or with everybody in the country. So this is a very busy chart, but I want you to just look at the numbers in red. This is a calculation of A, which is a measure of accuracy. The closer this is to 0, the more accurate the polls were. This is looking at all polls in competitive states across the country in states. This is where the problem happened. And the problem that you see here, going back to 2006 and up to 2016, is that there's no clear pattern of what methodology is more accurate, which frankly, a lot of media organizations have taken to mean that, well, we don't really have to worry about this then. We can use whatever poll we want. And that's unfortunately the case. So who should you believe? One thing I would do is recommend you go to the American Association for Public Opinion website, look at their survey sampling methods for political polling. They have a whole description there of things to do. And finally, to John's point, APOR also has a transparency initiative. It's like our seal of approval, so to speak, our good housekeeping seal that says that, well, we have a lot of different methods, but the thing you need to do is make your methods available so people can see what it is you're doing. But to wrap up, The one problem is, I can guarantee, is that we will still be having arguments about pollsters coming up after this election. This is a Halloween. I told you not to dress as a political pollster. The door gets slammed in your face and you get no candy. So thank you very much. And I'd welcome to hear the questions that you've got.
Well, thank you very much, Andy. And I want to thank everybody for what you've been able to do so far in terms of sharing your insights on polling. We have a number of questions, and let me just try to group them into some cohesive or coherent set of categories. First of all, we did have some general questions that I think a number of you may have already touched on, but the question here is from someone: do people tell the truth when polled? Have we learned any lessons on this in the 2016 elections? There's another question sort of related. Is there any evidence that some people don't want to admit they like a particular candidate when polled, so they don't necessarily tell the truth? Would someone like to take a crack at that set of questions?
Let me jump in on this simply because my old professor, George Bishop, was really big on this problem of social desirability in survey research. One thing that we do as humans is that we want to appear smart to other people. And we also want to appear that we're not on the unpopular side of an issue. So we see this in political polling in something called the spiral of silence theory that Elisabeth Noelle Neumann, a German public opinion researcher, came up with. That if you favor a candidate that you believe is less popular, you're less likely to put a sign in your yard, you're less likely to put a bumper sticker on your car, you're less likely to talk about them at the cocktail party, and you're less likely to tell a pollster that you support that person. You don't usually say you're going to vote for the other candidate, but you're much more likely to say you don't know, or you're not sure, or you haven't made up your mind, or as we saw in 2016, you just don't answer the phone. And I think this is a major problem that we have, and you just have to be aware of it. It's very difficult to overcome this as an issue as a pollster, but it is a major thing that we have to pay attention to.
Okay. Let's go to some other questions, unless somebody has something different to say about one of these, in which case try to get my attention. But we, back on the political candidate races, someone asked a question: what really is a horse race poll? But let me group several others. Is there likely to be a type of poll, such as random sample versus panel, that's likely to be more questionable than another? Nicole addressed that right up in the front in her opinion, but we can certainly discuss that. And then especially goes this question: in political races, if a result seems to be, say, 2 to 3 percentage points between candidates and the poll margin of error is twice that, is that result even worth reporting or considering? If so, how should it be reported? Who would like to take that one? Eric, you want to?
Sure, I'll jump in here. And horse race polls are standard election polls. Who are you planning to vote for in the upcoming election? Who is ahead at a particular point in time. These get reported throughout the course of campaigns. There's a lot of attention. As I said, with our surveys, we've asked a lot of questions. The coronavirus survey was mostly about public health, but where we got a lot of media coverage, including national media coverage, was with those 2 Senate election results for Montana and Colorado. So there's just a lot more interest in that horse race kind of polling. I think there are bigger questions about whether providing this information actually influences the election results. I think there's some ethical questions about that sort of thing. And then with the margins of error, again, these are point estimates. Something I didn't quite clarify in my presentation is the margin of error isn't saying anything about the gap between the candidates, right? It's a margin around that point estimate that we have for each candidate. But if they overlap, right, I showed those bars. If those bars are overlapping, there's a chance that it's a statistical tie, and we don't know for sure who's ahead. And I said with our April survey, that was the case, despite Bullock being up by 7 points. If you look at those margins of error, they overlapped. And so you get some information. I think it's worth reporting. But it's important to note that what the actual value of that information is and what could be the case.
Can I jump in real quick, Bill?
Sure, Nicole.
Just a couple things on that. If it's within the margin of error, it's a race that's too close to call. It's a tight race. I mean, that's how you would report it. It's too close to call. And I think that's responsible because I think people will still be interested and still go ahead with their duty to vote. And the other thing is that maybe you want to consider multiple surveys. And if a candidate is consistently 2 to 3 points ahead in every credible survey, there's probably a lead for that candidate. But I'd want to consider multiple sources. If you just have a single, it's a race that's just simply too close to call. It's an exciting race. Come down to the wire. And
Bill, I'd also like to jump in just a little bit. For the members of the media that are on this call, another plug for the Associated Press Style Guide. Associated Press provides criteria for using language to describe the difference between two candidates' point estimates in a poll. And for the media, I just really encourage you to look at those guidelines. They've been verified by statistical experts, and they're really solid. In summary, if the margin between the two candidates is greater than twice the margin of error, then you can say that one candidate is definitely leading the other. According to AP, if the difference between the two candidates' point estimates is between twice the margin of error and 1 time the margin of error, then you might be okay saying that one candidate has a slight lead. You might be. And Nicole would not really be comfortable with that, and I may not be either. But if it's less than 1 time the margin of error, then you definitely cannot say that one candidate is leading the other.
So I think what you're all speaking about here is responsibility of the media to help us understand what these polls are really saying, which we all want to be responsible citizens, but we also know that our media have a lot of responsibility in the way these polls are actually described. We also have a couple of other questions I want to get to here that have come in on chat. One is, how much review do polling organizations do each year to look back at their methodology? Andy, you want to take that one?
I'll speak to that. At the UNH Survey Center, we go back after every election and review the methods that we used. For example, after the 2016 election, we were one of the organizations that did not weight by education in 2016. And I hadn't done that in New Hampshire because since I've been here, an education weight simply had no impact on election results. It didn't matter. There was something unique about the Trump election in 2016 that made this matter, that we were getting people who had lower levels of education, particularly people that had some college education, that voted for Trump, that were just simply not answering our surveys. So we went back, looked at that, and identified that as a source of an issue, re-weighted our sample, including an education weight, and our predictions came out exactly right. Then we went back to all of the elections that we had going back to 1996 and included an education weight, and it made no difference. So we learned from that point on, we need to include an education weight as long as Donald Trump's in office and running for office. I should say that one of the things that's the reason that we didn't have it in, as a survey researcher, I want to make sure that it's the data speaking rather than my gut speaking when I'm looking at results. So I would rather do as little weighting, manipulation, changing of the data as possible, keep my weighting structures as elegant as possible with as few variables. In this case, we missed a significant variable that had an impact on that election. So yeah, we do that review after every election to see what it is that happened.
And would every one of the researchers here agree that you try to do a rigorous look back to see what you might have missed? I see heads nodding.
Absolutely. But also with the Bureau, we, because we don't do head-to-head political polling, we do include often questions from Census Bureau surveys or other gold standard surveys so that we can benchmark. We see whether we were off or not, and then ask why.
Okay.
Yeah.
We've had another couple of questions about, again, back to methodology. And one of the questions goes to what we've been talking about with respect to online polling. And it sort of goes to the question of, well, let me read the question. For polls or surveys that ask Montanans to reply online, how can they compensate or adjust for the fact that some rural areas have bad internet service, or that perhaps older people are not as likely to be comfortable with a computer or mobile device and so are under responding? Somebody want to shine some more light on that?
I mean, for political purposes, I simply would not use an online survey in Montana. It's not going to yield a credible result or something I would be confident in. It's just, there's certainly not enough email sample available in Montana to actually contact a representative sample. I'd have serious concerns about it.
So,
This is one of the
also,
things where-
go ahead, Andy. Go ahead.
One is the issues where it comes into a matter of whether it's a probability sample or a non-probability sample. And those non-probability opt-in panels are notoriously biased and have a whole series of problems. But what we've been experimenting with in New Hampshire is developing our own probability-based sample. Now here in New Hampshire, we have very high cell phone usage, and it's a small state. We got good cell phone coverage and good internet penetration. And what we found is over the last 2 years of experimenting with this probability sample is that we were actually slightly more accurate in predicting the New Hampshire primary this year with our web-based panel than we were at the telephone survey. We're continuing this sort of movement and looking into the future because frankly, I think in the future, we're going to see more and more and more organizations going to web-based surveys simply because the costs have become prohibitive. I'll give you an example. In New Hampshire, in 2016, we were getting about 0.9 completed surveys per hour. By 2020 now, we're getting about 0.4 completed interviews per hour of interviewing. That means our costs have more than doubled. So a survey that might have cost $25,000 to $30,000 4 years ago is costing $50,000 to $60,000 now, and media partners just don't have the state media partners just don't have the money to do that. So what we're looking forward to doing is providing a probability-based panel that's methodologically rigorous, that's still affordable to media organizations that want to have higher quality polling.
So what I'm hearing is the real difference is probability versus non-probability with the internet as a tool rather than a basis for selecting the respondents, maybe. I may not have articulated that well, but any other comments on that?
Yeah, Bill, two other things. First of all, there are two major constraints for every survey researcher on the planet. And we have to balance all of these constraints with our resources. So in general, we try to maximize accuracy while minimizing cost under this really heavy time constraint. In Montana, if you have a big time constraint, then some methods are likely off the table, regardless of cost or their effect on accuracy. However, if you are studying something that isn't affected by a short or long time frame, then you have a big luxury. And in that case, one of the best ways to go about doing that is a way that Eric has discovered and talked about, and Greater Montana Foundation has used. And that's using a probability address-based sample and contacting people by mail and giving them the opportunity to respond either on the internet or with a hard copy. That's maybe the nirvana answer if you have the luxury of time.
So we have a follow-up question actually that just came in while you were discussing this, and maybe this will be the last one on this subject, but given the rural and urban divide in Montana, are there any polls here that have a statistically relevant sample of both categories, that is urban and rural, rather than just assumed randomization?
I can answer that. I think Andrew touched on it. Is every survey should be representative of the entire population. So when we do a survey in Montana, we will set up what's called the sample frame by county. So each county is proportionally represented in the survey by its population. So you will get a good rural representation if surveys is adequately constructed. So you are getting the regional representation.
We've got a couple of questions. I'm sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, for Montana surveys in particular, our samples, all of them now, are stratified by randomly selected and stratified by both urban and rural. And we ensure that we get, our sample size is large enough to get enough responses from rural areas to say something meaningful and important about rural areas.
Let me just observe, and then I want to get back to some other interesting questions that are coming in. On the subject, because we had a couple of follow-up questions on this, of the media research that was done by the Bureau of Business and Economic Research for the GMF, I would just point people to the GMF website and the BBER website, because there is a lot of detail on media credibility using the methods that John just pointed out. We no need to get into that here, but I think a lot of the detail that people are asking about is available on those two websites. We've got a couple of questions, basically just saying, could somebody explain or talk briefly about decision markets? Somebody, I'm not even familiar with that term, but I'm not the expert.
I think what the question is referring to is essentially betting markets or futures markets in which you could purchase a share in a winning candidate. So it's a winner-take-all market. If you buy a share of Donald Trump, the cost of that share will fluctuate. Right now, I think he's at about 40 cents. Joe Biden's at about 60 cents roughly. That means if you could spend 60 cents to buy a share of Joe Biden and you win $1 at the end of it. The problem with these, and historically they've been pretty accurate, but other research that follows these things basically looks at the information that people are using when they make that decision to buy a share in a candidate is largely driven by polls. So it's still largely a poll-driven thing rather than an independent market that's operating independent of political information that everybody has access to.
Someone else has asked if someone will just touch on push polls.
I can do that really quickly. Got to give you the 30-second. I would tell you I'm not familiar because I don't do them. Any reputable political pollster does not do push polls. What a push poll is simply, it's not a poll. It's a misnomer. It's somebody calling you on the phone to disseminate negative information. They will ask you a question, are you male or female? And then they will proceed to give you 1 to 2 questions of simply negative information about a candidate in a race. That's a push poll. It's done under the guise of actual polling, and it is not. What we do, yes, we will occasionally test messaging about candidates in a race, both Republican and Democrat, to see how people respond. But we are collecting information. We are not our purpose is not simply to disseminate negative information. Our purpose is to collect information about it. And that is really one of and a push poll will just call thousands of people to disseminate bad stuff, whereas a real poll is representative, and we contact a few hundred people to gather information to inform a campaign.
Okay. Quickly,
Bill,
go ahead.
Yeah, if I could just add on to that, I would say that push polls don't have to be negative. The idea is that they're trying to push people in a certain direction. That's where the term comes from. And we see these in the mail in Montana. I've seen them from political candidates. I've seen them from the political parties. And they're trying to push you in the direction of the priorities of that candidate or the party. Now, when you have response options that really don't seem balanced from a partisan or an ideological point of view, that's a push poll.
Gotcha. Thank you. Someone asked, I get civics surveys. What are they? Anybody familiar with that particular survey? Okay. Someone asked,
Bill, I will, I
ahead.
have not heard of them. I will add, let's see if I can show this without. So I got something in the mail just the other day. It's called the Montana Opinion Survey. I tried to track down what this is. It looks legitimate. It's sent from, the company is in Rochester, Minnesota. It's sent from Sacramento. The website has almost no information. The privacy information on the website is completely different from what they say in the letter. And unfortunately, there's a lot of this going on, and it undermines what legitimate polls are trying to do. But it's important to be careful and to see if you can track down good polling organizations and operations will give you information about who they are, who you are, who they are, how they're funded, how they work, those kinds of things.
Let me pick up on that because I just happened to have had a kind of a case example sent regarding a national COVID poll that saw a Montana headline saying something like 3/4 of Montanans are wearing face masks. And in looking behind the survey, which had a number of good appearing university researchers with it, and contacting the researchers, apparently this was part of a panel poll. 129 respondents in Montana. The 3/4 came from, I think, 70 of those trying to represent that was the representation of 1 million Montanans and how many are wearing face masks. So again, a really good example. And by the way, I followed up, and the researchers would not tell me about how the panel was created, what the lists were, or what whether they were paid. So again, it's a question of, it takes some work sometimes to try to ferret out the things that you're talking about, Eric. And sometimes I know media people don't have the time or the staff to really dig deeply, but I think it is certainly important, and every effort ought to be made. That's my editorial comment. But any other comments on that before we try to wrap up with a couple more questions and comments?
Let me make one comment to your final point there, Bill. This really is the responsibility of media organizations to figure out what's going on with the methodology of surveys that you report. It's really something that needs to be done, and those questions that I think Traugott and Lavrakas talk about, and I emphasize, and other people in this panel have emphasized, are really an obligation for reporters to look at and for editors to look at. The downside is that people click on polls. Doesn't matter if they're a good poll or a bad poll, they're going to click on your website, and that's money. So there is that trade-off that you have to make, but it's your credibility at stake as journalists that really is the key of whether you're going to publish high quality things or not. And it's, in my view, it's well worth the time to investigate those things like Bill has just talked about, to make sure that you are providing information that's accurate, or at least you believe is accurate.
Well, we have just a few minutes, and I'd like to give, first of all, I want to thank everybody who sent in questions. Those were just amazing. But would each of you like to take 30 seconds or so before we wrap up here with any final thoughts or anything that you pulled out of this discussion that you'd like to highlight or share?
Sure, I'll start and go quickly. There was a question in the comments in the chat about poll herding, which is polls looking at what other results are and trying to match those results to look reputable, which is a problem. But getting back to something Nicole had said, you need to consider each poll as just one data point, right? A lot of like 538 and New York Times and now CNN are doing these poll of polls where you look at all the polls and the average among the polls. And that really is better information than any single poll, which might have gotten a bad sample. So we can put some credence in each poll, but it's important to look at what's happening more globally.
Okay. Anybody else have a close? Andy?
Let me speak to that point because I agree that if you I agree with Eric to say that if you're looking at high quality polls, it's a good thing to do. That averaging is probably a better thing, a way to understand things better. Unfortunately, a lot of the poll averages that you've seen, and certainly the ones we saw in the 2016 elections, were based on very poor quality polls. And if you have, I use this as an analogy with my students, if you have a glass of pure Poland spring water in one hand and a glass of water that you lifted out of a mud puddle on the street in the other hand, and you mixed them together, would you want to drink it? That's kind of what we're doing that with some of these polling aggregators are doing by putting high quality research in with poor quality research and saying that somehow that makes all of the research better.
Okay.
I
Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I just finished with, just to piggyback on that, is there are still high quality polls out there. They're still available. They still exist. They're just more expensive. If you're going to do something that's really rigorous and high quality, it's a serious trade-off in the industry. But there are still very reliable polls out there. They just have a lot of rigor behind them and they get expensive. So you just have to carefully dissect between surveys and who's doing it with the utmost rigor and those that are not, because there are certainly those out there that are not.
And John, any final thoughts?
Yes, to Nicole's point, Montana is a little bit of a polling desert in the sense that many national organizations are doing polling here, but not really disclosing what they're finding. The primary reason that Montana has a bit of a dearth of polling results is price. Rigor now, because of declining response rates, costs much, much more than it did 10 years ago. So it's tough. It's a tough business right now, but I'm super grateful to organizations like the Greater Montana Foundation, who are willing to fund rigorous survey research because it provides us as citizens the information we need to make decisions.
Thank you, John. And I want to thank each and every one of you also for being with us today and for contributing to what I think is just a marvelous program, and would love to have you back sometime to see as we look back on all of this. And also, I think we've heard a lot about how polls can be informative. They can provide useful insights, but they can also sometimes be less than helpful depending on methodology. That's one of the things I certainly got out of the program. They can be misleading depending on ethics of the researchers, I suspect. And sometimes maybe a poll isn't as worthy of a lot of media attention as it should be. But again, all of this requires us to look more deeply at the methodology and all of those things that our panelists have discussed, which leaves us as citizens and media with a responsibility. And as we come to the end of our Montana Field Guide to 2020 election polls, I want to again thank all of the participants, all of those who sent in questions, and our panelists for sure. I also want to especially thank those who helped us promote this program. There are really way too many to name all of them, but I want to especially thank the Montana Chamber, as John said, for the technical and promotion assistance, also the Montana Broadcasters Association, the Montana Newspapers Association, and of course the University of Montana, and all the others who have shared information on this with members. Thanks also to Bo Wilkaszewski, the fellow that you haven't seen, who's behind running this webinar. Thank you, Bo. And we want to thank, of course, the Greater Montana Foundation and the Bureau of Business and Economic Research. We've all learned a lot about how to be better poll consumers, and I hope that you found the time this morning to be well spent. Remember that we do plan to have a link posted on the websites of the University of Montana Bureau of Business and Economic Research and the Greater Montana Foundation, whose addresses are seen here. And they all are, of course, accessible through a search engine if you don't remember the web address. But on behalf of the Greater Montana Foundation and the BBER, again, let me thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.